to this? Do we think that the government is justified in its concern that this is a matter of national security, or do we sense that there is an element that they're almost a little bit embarrassed and concerned about what could be on some of those hard drives, and that was why the destruction was required?
They're in a state of panic. They've overreached themselves, and examination of what they're trying to hide suggests that the terror, if there's any terror, is that we in Britain should be terrified that a whole secret network has been built to spy on everything we do without parliamentary knowledge or approval, and indeed under a smokescreen of dishonesty and deception. The claims of terrorism are as absurd as when I first exposed GCHQ 30 years ago. It was a complete secret, operating out with the law. And the consequence of that was very similar. 2 journalists, Americans who helped me, were deported, and I was arrested and eventually faced espionage charges and 30 years imprisonment. It all fell apart under public ridicule. The same thing happened again in the 80s with books on intelligence and a program I made for the BBC. Claims of national security fell apart, the modern name terrorism. But yes, of course there's terrorists out there, and yes, they mean us harm. It does not follow that what GCHQ is trying to hide and getting the government and the strong-arm boys in to try and keep away from us has anything to do with protecting us from terrorists.
I suppose the reality is we actually know very, very little about GCHQ compared to MI5 and other sort of observational parts of the government. The question I suppose that I would ask is that the government is hinting to us that there is a justifiable reason, A, for that detention and B, for Hayward's intervention. Are we to believe then what we're hearing, for example, from the Home Secretary, that Miranda possessed documents that could have helped terrorists and could possibly lead to loss of life, or do we question that?
Whether David Miranda was carrying material or not, I simply don't know, and nor do they. It simply had, whether or not he was carrying it, had nothing to do with terrorists. It had to do with GCHQ's spying on people in Britain. It had to do with GCHQ's trying to build an empire of secret surveillance around the world. And that is what the Cabinet Secretary was desperately trying to hide.
It's interesting to see as well that Washington is trying to distance itself from what the government has been saying here, and has certainly been saying that laws in place over there would have prevented the government in the States from intervening with any sort of newspaper proprietor in a similar way.
Britain is being disgraced by the American actions, although what GCHQ does is really largely driven by a desperate need to stay under the American wing that they see. The Americans have declassified material. They've announced that they will reveal secret laws that they were made. They've accepted that some of this never ought to have been secret. Britain has just tried, in a traditional knee-jerk way, to try and hit the messenger. What GCHQ has to learn, and what ministers ought to take notice of the lessons of history. GCHQ and the British nation survived being brought out into the open. It took 17 years after my articles for GCHQ to actually be made legal and accountable. But they are now accountable, and they have spent a year on a deception of Parliament, claiming that they needed new capabilities and £1 billion to be spent on them. Well, now we know they had them all along and were hiding them away. They are going to be held accountable for those deceptions, and that is what scares them. Not Islamic terrorists. They're terrified of us.
In this particular instance, if the government is acting in good faith, that they believe that, for example, these hard drives contain material that could lead to loss of life, don't they have a duty to get those back? Wouldn't we be standing here discussing it if they hadn't have acted?
It's an absurd argument, and let me tell you why. Every policeman, every police station in the country has a duty and a role to protect us from terrorists. That's part of their job. Do we therefore say that every policeman must be secret, that we must never see their photographs, that we do not know where police stations are? Of course GCHQ has a valid role in finding out information about terrorists and giving that information to break their plots. What they have not learnt is how to live in a civil society with a sense of proportion, that they are accountable citizens to the extent they spy on us. They have to make their case for the scale of astounding spying that they are doing, out with the codes of human rights that we're set up to. And I don't think they have that case. If they could make the case, they can make it openly. The question is what they've got to hide.
Do you think we are, as a nation, more free than when you were making your revelations about GCHQ in the 1970s, or do you think we're seeing a sort of clawback on free speech?
It's a sort of sawtooth effect. Progressively, they have been brought out into the open. They have learned that that is something that is actually not a problem to doing their proper jobs. But the old secret institutions and the desperate need to hang on to budgets and secret missions and an alliance with the United States is driving a great deal of this.
Okay, thank you very much for your time. Really good to talk to you, Mr. Campbell. Thank you.